Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. When I saw him, my heart skipped a beat. It was a strange sensation that awoke in me the moment I saw him stepping out of the car. A young man with a rebellious look and a faint smile on his lips. Jet, Hayes's nephew. He had changed a little since I last saw him, though it hadn't been long, only a year. And yet, something in his gaze seemed completely different. He was more confident, bolder, as if life had slightly reshaped him. I stood by the living room window, watching as he leisurely shut the car door, casting a glance in my direction. Our eyes met. That fleeting exchange of looks suddenly stirred something old and nearly forgotten within me. My heart began to race. I didn't know how to respond to this feeling, and quickly looked away, trying to collect myself. When Jet entered the house, I was already in the hallway, greeting him with the same polite smile I had worn for years. I welcomed him like an old friend, and he responded with a brief nod, still looking at me intently, as if wanting to say something but unsure where to start. His presence felt unsettling, yet somehow alluring. "Hi, Lainey," he said, pausing at the threshold. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't grasp. "Good to see you again." "It's good to see you too, Jet," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "How was your journey?" "It wasn't bad. You know, sometimes the road is the best place to gather your thoughts." His words sounded almost like a hint. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. My husband, Hayes, stood beside me, smiling and embracing his nephew, unaware of the turmoil inside me. They began chatting about something, while I stood slightly apart, watching Jet out of the corner of my eye, unsure of what was happening to me. A sense of unease lingered. A casual glance, a quick exchange of words, and I felt trapped in a web of strange emotions. At dinner, Jet sat across from me. He laughed often, spoke of his plans and travels, about how he decided to take a break after a tough breakup to reflect and rethink his life. His voice was deep, soft, and the more I listened, the more it felt like I was part of some forbidden conversation. "How do you like it here, Lainey?" he suddenly asked, breaking through my thoughts. "Do you like your new home?" "Yes, it's cozy." I paused, unsure how to continue. "And it's peaceful here. Although, sometimes, maybe a little too peaceful." Hayes didn't seem to catch the hidden meaning in my words, but Jet did. A faint interest flashed in his eyes. He leaned closer, smiling slightly, and looked at me with such sincerity that it made me a little uncomfortable. "Sometimes peace can be exhausting, can't it?" he said in a slightly softer voice, as if speaking only to me. His tone, his words, they were filled with a hidden undertone that only I could sense. "Jet, are you always this philosophical?" I tried to joke, but my voice betrayed a slight tremor. "Maybe," his gaze still fixed on mine. "It helps to understand what really matters in life." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to end the conversation, but another part of me felt that in every word he spoke, there was something I'd longed to hear. As we rose from the table, I moved toward the window, looking out to distract myself. Hayes approached from behind, wrapping his arms around my shoulders, kissing me on the temple. My husband, who meant so much to me, whom I genuinely loved. I turned away from the window, glancing around the living room, noticing that Jet was watching me. His gaze was the same, troubling, captivating. Later, as I was clearing the dishes in the kitchen, Jet approached to help, holding a glass of wine. He did it so calmly, as if it were a natural part of his life, and I felt strange. The nearness of his figure, his calmness, it felt like too much, yet for some reason, I liked it. "You rarely take time to relax, Lainey," he said, leaning on the counter. "I think you should let yourself unwind." "Maybe you're right." I tried to smile, but knew my words sounded too dry. Jet nodded quietly, stepping back a bit, but his gaze lingered a little longer than necessary. I looked away, pretending to focus on my tasks, but I couldn't ignore the quickening of my breath. Why did his words and glances affect me so much? Why did I want to know what lay behind his mysterious smile? When I returned to the bedroom, Hayes was already asleep. I lay beside him, trying to catch his familiar scent, to feel protected. But instead of peace, I felt the same strange sensation, as though something had slipped away, something that had once been important but was now lost in the past. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts drifted back to Jet, to his gaze, his voice. An overwhelming feeling took hold of me, as if a door I had feared opening was once again within reach. The next morning, trying to shake off the strange tension from last night, I went to a local cafe. It was cozy and unpretentious, with slightly worn wooden tables and soft jazz music that muffled the city noise outside. A place where I liked to stop before starting my day, just to enjoy a moment of peace with a cup of coffee. When I looked up from the menu, I saw Jet. He stood by the counter with a cup in hand, slightly smiling and looking right at me. For some reason, his presence no longer felt like a coincidence. "Lainey, hey!" Jet approached me, as if his being here was the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning." "Jet, hi," I replied, hiding my slight embarrassment behind a smile. "You're always up this early?" He smirked and shrugged. "Habit. I think it helps start the day on the right note. Do you come here often?" "Every time I feel like taking a break before diving into work," I replied, feeling how unexpectedly easy the conversation flowed. We chose a table in the corner, away from prying eyes. Jed asked how I was, and I responded with the usual polite words, saying everything was fine. But with each question, our words grew deeper, and the conversation took on an unusual openness. "You know, Lainey, I've always thought you were the kind of woman who has everything under control, like a calm lighthouse amid all this chaos. Was I wrong?" He looked at me so intently that it made me uneasy. "Wrong?" I chuckled, trying to hide my discomfort. "Maybe I'm just good at pretending." Jet grinned and leaned a little closer, as if trying to see something beyond the calm exterior I had worked so hard to maintain. "I think you have a lot of unspoken thoughts. No offense," he added. "It's just, I feel like you're hiding something." I felt a wave of discomfort, as if he could see everything I'd long hidden, even from myself. I tried to change the subject, but Jet didn't seem willing to let it go. His gaze remained persistent, and it attracted me more than I cared to admit. "And what do you think I'm hiding?" I decided to play along, though my voice faltered slightly. It felt as if each of his answers could open a door I'd kept locked for so long. He paused for a moment, and something like doubt flickered in his eyes, as though he wasn't sure if he should go on. But then he suddenly leaned in closer, too close, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "You know," he whispered, "sometimes there's no need to search for something complicated. Sometimes a single moment is enough." I didn't have time to respond. Jet suddenly leaned in and brushed his lips against mine. It was so sudden and swift that I didn't even have time to be surprised before he pulled back, as if he couldn't believe what he'd done. We both fell silent, and for several long seconds, everything around us faded away. Jet looked at me, his face tense, and in his eyes, I saw a mixture of embarrassment and wonder, like he didn't even understand what had driven him to do it. "Sorry," he finally murmured, running a hand through his hair. I I don't know what came over me." I sat there, unsure how to react. His apology sounded sincere, but I couldn't just ignore what had happened. He had touched me in a way no one else had in years. The moment was brief, but it was enough to awaken feelings I'd buried long ago. It's, it's just, I began, struggling for words. Maybe it was just an impulse? "Yeah," he replied quietly, looking a little embarrassed. "Sometimes words aren't enough. Sorry if I crossed a line." I looked at him, trying to manage the flood of emotions within me, and for a fleeting moment, I wanted to repeat that kiss. But instead, I straightened, trying to maintain a composed appearance. "No, it's okay," I finally replied, hiding the tremor in my voice. Sometimes, boundaries don't seem so clear. I felt myself blushing, and at that moment, our interaction already felt somewhat inappropriate, but I couldn't make myself leave. We continued to sit there, feeling both awkward and strangely close. Jet looked at me with a sad, soft smile, as if he understood more than he should. I could feel that delicate yet powerful connection forming between us, one that wasn't easy to ignore. Our conversation didn't resume. We simply looked at each other, and the silence became thick, enveloping us, as if the air in this cafe had filled with something left unsaid. After that morning kiss in the cafe, I tried to convince myself it was a fluke, a moment driven by impulse. But no matter how hard I tried, the feeling it left didn't fade. It was as if his touch had left a mark on me, something deeply personal, almost forbidden. From that moment, I knew I had to stay away from Jet. This situation was beginning to slip beyond reason, and I desperately tried to keep control over myself and my life. Hayes and I had everything one could call stability: a home, comfort, routines. Yet now, even when I was with my husband, my thoughts drifted back to Jet. I realized that this attachment to another person was a dangerous path, but resisting it was unbearably difficult. I distracted myself with household chores, cleaning the kitchen, repotting plants, organizing closets. But every time I allowed myself a brief pause, my thoughts circled back to that moment in the cafe. I caught myself recalling his gaze, his voice. I could almost see him, looking at me, with that slight smile. My throat would go dry as I realized I kept returning to these thoughts, again and again. At some point, I wondered, why am I reacting this way? I remembered last night with Hayes. We sat in the same room, each occupied with our own tasks. He checked emails while I flipped through a magazine, trying to keep myself distracted. Between us was a calm, yet chilly silence that had long since become the norm. I never thought I'd start to miss the moments that spark something, that stir and enliven. The next day, still feeling the inner conflict, I decided to spend the day immersed in household duties. As I tended to the garden, I thought that perhaps I should put more effort into reconnecting with Hayes, to rekindle the lost sense of closeness. I'd always thought of our marriage as strong, but now I started noticing the empty space that had grown between us. Our feelings seemed to have cooled, and routines and obligations had pushed everything else aside. When I heard Hayes come into the house, I went to greet him, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts of Jet. "Hey, how was your day?" I asked, smiling at him. "Tiring," he replied shortly, without looking up. "You know, we're overloaded with reports again." He went into the study, leaving me standing in the hallway, still holding his coat that he'd left in my hands. This brief exchange reminded me of how separate our lives had become. We lived side by side, but had become like strangers, and in that moment, I thought of Jet again, of how he looked at me as if he wanted to understand me, not just hear surface-level answers to routine questions. These thoughts were dangerous, and I tried to push them away, but I couldn't manage it. I tried to distract myself, diving into daily tasks, but no matter what I did, Jet still haunted me. His gaze, his touch, that kiss, it all stayed with me, like a restrained flame that burned inside. In the kitchen, I found myself thinking of him again. How he laughed, how he moved, how he would brush past my shoulder in passing. I tried to rid myself of these thoughts, deeming them a betrayal. But the moment they surfaced, I couldn't help wanting to return to them, over and over. The next day, as I tried to keep myself even busier with household chores to stay distracted, there was a knock at the door. Standing on the doorstep was Jet, with a slight smile that seemed to hint at some unheard-of proposition. "Lainey, hey," he greeted. "I have an idea. If you're not busy, maybe we could take a drive out of town. I'd like to show you a place." I hesitated, fully aware of where this might lead. but there was something in his eyes that made me forget my reservations. Where exactly? I asked, trying to sound calm, though a surge of excitement was building inside. Remember the old barn on the edge of town? His hands slipped into his pockets, and he leaned in slightly, his voice softer. That place has always meant something special to me. It's where I always find peace. I'd like to show it to you. His words made me wary, but curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. We drove in his car, and in the quiet of the road, my anticipation only grew. Do you go there often? I broke the silence as trees and hills started to roll by, beyond the city limits. Whenever I need to think, to sort myself out, he replied, keeping his eyes on the road. I think everyone needs a place like that, don't you think? I think so, yes. I smiled slightly, turning my gaze to the window. But I feel like I've lost my place. At some point, life fills with duties and responsibilities, and suddenly you realize there's no time for anything else. He nodded in silence, and for a moment, we were enveloped in stillness. But it wasn't an emptiness. The air in the car was charged, and I felt it on my skin. When we finally arrived at the barn, I was struck by its atmosphere. It was old but sturdy, standing in the middle of a small field, surrounded by silence and the faint scent of grass. It's beautiful here, I said, barely stepping out of the car. I'm glad you think so, Jet replied, a smile evident in his voice. You know, Lainey, I've wanted to tell you something for a long time. He started talking about his life, about how lost he felt after breaking up with his girlfriend. I listened to him, and each story he shared seemed to open up not only a part of him, but something within me as well. Aren't you afraid things will change? I asked, when he mentioned how he sometimes doubted his future. Of course I am, he sighed, tilting his head up to the sky. But what else can I do? Stay in the same place, afraid to move forward? I think that's even scarier. I pondered his words, feeling each one resonate within me. And aren't you scared, Lainey? He asked, looking straight into my eyes. Yes, I admitted, sensing that hiding my thoughts was pointless. Sometimes it feels like everything I do is just living up to others' expectations, but in doing so, I lose myself. Jet looked at me, and in his gaze I saw understanding, as if he truly saw through me. You know, I've always admired you, Lainey, he said quietly, and there was a sincerity in his voice that made my heart skip a beat. What for? I tried to mask my embarrassment with a smile, yet I couldn't look away from his eyes. For your strength. But maybe that strength isn't always what you need. He leaned in slightly, his gaze unyielding. Sometimes it's okay to let yourself be vulnerable. His words sounded like permission for something I had been holding back for so long, but instead of giving in, I took a step back, trying to keep control of myself. Thank you for bringing me here, Jet. I tried to add some lightness to our conversation, though inside, I was burning from the tension. This place really is special. He nodded, not moving away. I'm glad you liked it. But, Lainey, you don't always have to hold back. I just want you to know that if you need to say something, to feel something, I'm here. His words caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. We stood in silence beside the barn, and it felt as though the air around us grew thicker with each passing second. Returning home was harder than I expected. After that day with Jet by the barn, everything that once felt ordinary now irritated me with its familiarity. I tried to forget what happened between us, not the actions themselves, but the feelings that surfaced and left a mark on me. I needed to come back to reality, to what Hayes and I had, and focus on our marriage. In the evening, when Hayes came home from work, I prepared his favorite dish, and as I set the table, a desperate urge to regain something lost washed over me. I smiled at him as he walked into the dining room, trying to start a conversation that might bring back our closeness. How was your day? I asked, hoping for some response that would offer a hint of warmth. Hayes glanced at me briefly, sighing tiredly. There was a lot of work, he mumbled, diving into his food. This project takes so much time that it feels like I'm only home to sleep. I waited for more, but he fell silent, focused on his dinner. A cold feeling crept inside me. I tried to keep the conversation going, hoping it might somehow bridge the gap that had opened between us. It's been a while since we went out together, I said, trying to sound casual. Maybe we should have a night just for the two of us? Forget everything else and just enjoy each other's company? Hayes looked up for a second, appearing thoughtful, and I felt a fleeting sense of hope. That's a good idea, Lainey, but, you know, I've got a lot of work in the coming weeks. Maybe in a month or two? He returned to his meal, and I felt my desire for closeness become even more futile. We sat in silence, not the cozy, peaceful kind, but a silence that pressed down like a wall, each brick reminding me of what happened with Jet. I knew I had no right to these feelings, but on the other hand, I felt crushed by this indifference and daily coldness. After dinner, I went to the living room to try talking to Hayes, to at least attempt to bring back what we once had. When he sat beside me, I wrapped my arms around him, hoping that closeness might somehow revive us. You know, I miss us, I whispered. I miss the times when we could talk about anything, when we were honest with each other. Hayes looked at me with slight surprise, as if my words were too emotional. Lainey, what's wrong with you? He asked, cautiously, as if I were speaking about something trivial. Everything's fine, isn't it? We have a stable life, no reason for concern. Yes, but is that enough? I felt the words pour out on their own. Hayes, sometimes it feels like we're just living side by side, not together. It feels like we've become strangers. He frowned slightly, and I sensed his irritation growing. He didn't understand me, and it seemed like he wasn't even trying. Lainey, I'm working for us, for our stability, he answered with frustration. Isn't that enough? It's not just about stability, Hayes. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. It's about us, about how we don't feel each other anymore. We've become empty. You're overthinking it, Lainey, he said, standing up and moving to the window, rubbing his temples wearily. Maybe you just need a distraction. Maybe find a hobby or something else to keep you busy. I fell silent, feeling something break inside. His words cut deeper than I expected. I looked at his back, at the indifferent expression on his face, and understood that all my efforts, my attempts, had been in vain. I was searching for the connection we once shared, but now that connection seemed impossible. You know, Hayes, I tried to speak calmly, but my voice betrayed my emotions. Sometimes it feels like I'm doing everything for us, and you don't even notice. He remained silent, and his silence spoke more than any words could. The next day, it felt like I was actively searching for a reason to leave the house, to escape the familiar silence and daily routines. Part of me still hoped that I could find distraction, some comfort in solitude or tasks. But when my phone rang and Jet's name appeared on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. Lainey, hey, I was just thinking. His voice was calm, yet I caught a hint of anticipation in it. Want to go for a walk? In the woods nearby? I promise, it's just a walk. I hesitated for a moment, but then, as if driven by some unknown force, I agreed. We met at the edge of the forest, and after walking a bit further in, I felt that special silence that only trees can provide. All around us was nature, and in its quiet, there was something undeniably alluring. I've always loved this place, Jet said, looking around. It makes you feel free from everything, like you can hide from all your problems here. That's true, I nodded. When I was a kid, I'd often go into the woods near home. I'd take refuge there whenever something didn't go right or felt overwhelming. It always seemed like the trees understood more than people did. He smiled, and his gaze softened, as if he was seeing something more in me than just his uncle's wife. Still feel the same way since you were a kid? He asked, his voice quieter. At some point, I stopped seeking refuge in the woods. I just got used to handling things on my own, I replied, feeling a soft sadness as childhood memories surfaced. We continued deeper into the forest, soon finding ourselves in a place where the trees grew denser. In this quiet, secluded spot, time seemed to fade away, and our steps were muffled by the soft moss underfoot. I glanced at Jet. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Jet, you know it's not that simple, I murmured, feeling something tremble inside. I know, he said, his gaze meeting mine, his face turning serious. But some things can't be ignored. Before I could respond, Jet stepped closer. This time, he didn't pull back. His hands gently touched my shoulders, and he leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in the faintest of kisses. When Jet pulled away, I stood there, unsure of what to say. My mind was a storm of contradictions, fear and pleasure, guilt, and something new, uncontrollable. Laney? He whispered, his hand resting lightly on mine. Forgive me if this is wrong, but I couldn't help it. I stood there, feeling the tremor running through me. We both knew this was supposed to end here, in this forest. But we also understood that something important had already happened, and there was no going back. Returning home felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Everything that once seemed familiar and comforting now only triggered irritation and discomfort. I tried not to think about what had happened in the woods with Jet, but the memories stubbornly resurfaced, forcing me to relive that moment over and over. I tried convincing myself that I could forget it, that it was just a mistake to be erased from my mind. But these feelings overpowered me. When Hayes came home that evening, I greeted him with my usual smile, though it cost me a great deal of effort. He started talking about work, sharing how his colleagues were struggling with their tasks, and I nodded as if I were listening, but my thoughts were miles away. Laney, are you listening? He finally asked, frowning slightly when I missed his words yet again. Sorry, Hayes, yes, of course I'm listening, I replied with a forced smile, trying to hide my embarrassment. You've seemed distant lately, he noted, his voice tinged with caution. Is something wrong? Everything's fine, I quickly replied, feeling a wave of anxiety rise within me. I'm probably just tired. He nodded, but there was doubt in his gaze. Hayes was practical, accustomed to having everything under control. He likely wasn't prepared for his wife to be so consumed by something beyond his understanding. Despite his concern, he didn't press me with more questions, simply looking at me skeptically before returning to his own matters. The tension between us only grew. I tried to ignore my feelings for Jet, to focus on home and work, but each interaction with Hayes made me feel more and more like a stranger. I found myself becoming irritated over little things, feeling exhausted even by his usual questions. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Hayes tried to start a conversation, clearly sensing that something was wrong. He sat next to me and took my hand, but I instinctively pulled it away, feeling a strange sense of aversion. Laney, what's going on with you? He asked, looking at me intently, trying to understand. Nothing, I replied too sharply, realizing my voice held a hint of irritation. This doesn't feel like nothing, he said, frowning. It feels like you're not here. I feel like you're pulling away from me, and I don't understand why. I sighed, trying to keep my emotions in check. Inside, I felt as though I was on the edge, as if these emotions were close to breaking free. I wished he would leave me alone, stop asking questions for which I had no answers. Hayes, maybe I'm just tired. Work, home. It can all be draining sometimes, I said, trying to sound convincing. But I know you, Laney. This isn't like you. We've always been open with each other. What's changed? He reached for my hand again, but I pulled back as if his touch had become something foreign to me. Maybe it's not just that, I murmured, not even knowing what I meant to say. Then what is it? Help me understand, Lainey. I want to know, he said, his voice carrying a mix of hurt and genuine confusion. I looked at him and suddenly felt an invisible wall between us. He looked at me as if searching for answers, but I had none to give. All I could do was avoid his gaze, retreat behind a strained smile and excuses of being busy. Sorry, Hayes, but I really just need some time to myself, I said softly. Give me some space to sort things out. He remained seated on the couch, silently and helplessly, watching me as I left for the bedroom, feeling bitterness and estrangement building inside me. In the following days, I gradually came to realize that my feelings for Jet went far deeper than a fleeting infatuation. It was more than a passing interest or mere attraction. There was a connection between us that defied logic and reason. Yet, with this realization came a stark awareness of the danger. I loved Hayes, as contradictory as it sounded. I loved him for being my rock, for the calm and predictability of our life, for the values and memories we shared. We had built our life together year after year, and to destroy it all for Jet seemed foolish, even insane. I tried to fight it, to convince myself that I could stop this. I avoided Jet's gaze, didn't respond to his messages, and did my best not to be alone with him. I knew I had to end this story before it went too far. But each time I saw him, my heart clenched, and I couldn't deny that I was drawn to him in a way I'd never felt before. One evening, when I stepped out into the backyard to escape my thoughts, he suddenly appeared beside me. I froze, feeling his presence even before he spoke. Lainey, it feels like you've been avoiding me these past few days, he said softly, his voice laced with hidden tension. Jet, please! I lowered my head, unable to look him in the eyes. This is all wrong. I can't do this. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. I felt his eyes piercing through me, as if searching for the truth I was hiding. Lainey, you feel it too, don't you? His voice was insistent, almost pleading. I know this is complicated, but pretending there's nothing between us isn't right either. You don't understand, Jet, I whispered, struggling with the lump forming in my throat. I'm risking everything, losing the person I built my life with, losing myself. He was silent, and in the quiet, I could feel my heart pounding. Everything I'd said was true, but the truth didn't lessen the desperate longing that grew stronger with each passing day. Lainey, I'm not asking you to make a choice, he finally said, his voice barely audible. But I want you to be honest with yourself. Don't fight what you're feeling. You're not alone in this. I turned away, feeling tears well up in my eyes. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to feel his closeness, to forget everything I was supposed to feel. But another part of me was screaming that I had to stop. Jet, please, I repeated, summoning all my strength to keep from stepping toward him. I have to end this. But even as I said the words, I knew that fighting this would be nearly impossible. The evening was cool, and by the time I pulled up to the old barn on the edge of town, the sun was already setting behind the horizon, casting a warm glow over everything. This place had always been enveloped in peace and silence, and now it seemed more secluded than ever. I got out of the car, holding back a wave of confusion that was growing stronger inside me. Jet was standing against the barn wall, his gaze fixed on me. I couldn't decide what unsettled me more, the place itself or his insistent, slightly troubled look that seemed to read me like an open book. Lainey, thank you for coming, he said, stepping closer, but not too close, as if giving me the space I so desperately needed. I don't know where to start. Jet, I don't think we should, I stammered, unable to find the right words. You do realize this isn't right? He nodded, looked at me, and sighed. I understand, Lainey. But can you really call a lie something you feel with every fiber of your being? His voice was firm, and I knew his words held the full truth of his feelings. Since I came here, I've tried to hold myself back, but every time I see you, I feel like I'm losing control. I didn't know how to respond. Everything I felt was chaotic, a mix of guilt, fear, and yes, something incredible I couldn't deny. Looking at him, I could see he was sincere, that these words weren't easy for him to say. Jet, I paused, realizing that any honesty would lead to consequences I wasn't ready for. I feel something too. But what does that give us? Don't you see that I'm afraid of losing my life? Of destroying everything Hayes and I had? He leaned in closer, his eyes filled with both despair and determination. Lainey, you don't have to change anything, he said quietly but firmly. But you owe it to yourself to be honest. If you feel something, it doesn't mean you have to abandon everything, but denying it, it's like ignoring part of your soul. These words penetrated deep into my heart, and I realized he was right. I was fighting with myself, with feelings that grew inside me as if breaking through the walls I'd tried to build around myself. And at that moment, standing next to him, I found it easier to admit that I could no longer hide my emotions. I tried to run from this, tried to convince myself it would pass, I said, feeling my voice tremble with emotion. But the truth is, every time I see you, everything else stops mattering. And that terrifies me. I understand, he replied, placing a hand on my shoulder, and the touch was so gentle it took my breath away. But Lainey, we can give ourselves freedom without destroying what's important to both of us. His words felt like a promise, something warm and reassuring. But even with that reassurance, I knew it was only an illusion, that somewhere inside me there was a growing sense of inevitability. Yes, I was attached to Jet, and despite all the fears, all the doubts, I could no longer deny it. That day started like any other weekday, and I was certain Hayes, as always, would return late in the evening. We had long settled into this predictable routine. He left early and came back late, barely managing to have dinner before either falling asleep in the chair or heading straight to bed. However, when I heard the sound of his car in the driveway in the middle of the day, I nearly dropped my coffee cup. Hayes, home? This early? I forced myself to stay calm, but a strange unease crept over me. Lainey, are you home? His voice echoed as I frantically tried to hide any trace of my tension. I set down the cup and book on the table and went to meet him, doing my best to look as usual. Yes, Hayes, I'm here, I replied with a light smile, though I felt a tightness within. You're home early today. He stopped in the doorway, his brow slightly furrowed. I noticed something cautious flicker in his eyes. Normally, he was so predictable, but this time, his gaze lingered on me longer than usual, as if he were searching for something or trying to understand. Yeah, work wrapped up early today, so I thought I'd come home, he said, not taking his eyes off me. You look tired. A little. It's just been a long day, I smiled, trying to appear nonchalant. I steadied myself and walked over to the kitchen counter, busying myself with the dishes to cover my discomfort. Hayes moved closer, standing just behind me, and I felt his intense gaze piercing through me as though he were trying to decipher what I was hiding. His silence grew more oppressive, and I felt he could sense my unease. Lainey, his voice softened, but there was a note of concern in it. Is something wrong? I feel like you've been distant lately. No, everything's fine, really, I replied quickly, trying to sound convincing. Maybe it's just fatigue building up. Fall always feels draining. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave me. I could feel his doubts deepening, and he didn't seem ready to drop the subject. Look, if something's wrong, I'd like to know, he said, measured but with a care that suddenly made it hard for me to breathe. We've always been honest with each other. I felt the tension inside me begin to rise to the surface, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to keep my true feelings hidden. Memories of every encounter with Jet flashed through my mind, every look, every touch, and a wave of shame washed over me. Hayes, really, nothing's going on, I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Everything's fine. It's just been A bit of a tense week. He nodded, but I could see his doubts were far from dispelled. He stepped closer and gently placed his hands on my shoulders. His touch was soft, almost tentative, but I felt uncomfortable. I tried to make myself return the embrace, but the discomfort was stronger, and I merely patted his shoulder lightly, as if that would convince him that everything was truly fine. Hayes froze for a moment, and I noticed how he held his gaze, unwilling to show his lingering doubts. It seemed as if something weighed on him, but he decided not to press the issue. He took a step back and nodded, as if telling himself not to give in to speculation. "All right," he said quietly, glancing at me again with a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know that if anything happens, you can talk to me." "Thank you, Hayes," I murmured, looking down and feeling a growing sense of guilt. "I'll remember that." We stood there in the kitchen, and a silence fell between us that no longer felt comfortable. Each day, my internal struggle intensified. I felt that the connection between Jet and me had become something more than I could control. It was no longer a fleeting passion or flirtation. It had turned into something that seeped into every thought, every feeling. And yet I understood that our affair was destroying everything that once mattered to me. One day, left alone at home, I sat in the living room, reflecting on where my decisions had led. Images flashed before my eyes. Quiet evenings with Hayes, his familiar smile, his caring eyes, now full of suspicion and worry. I knew I had betrayed his trust, broken something he had genuinely believed was solid. His home, his family, all of it seemed different now because of my actions. I recalled my last conversation with Jet near the barn. Back then, his words, his touch, felt like the only thing that brought comfort. But now, looking at it all with a cold clarity, I realized that in that comfort lay even more pain and guilt. I picked up my phone and looked at Jet's number. My finger hovered over the screen, and I felt a tremor. Something inside me resisted. Something wanted to see him again, to hear his voice. But alongside this grew a firm sense that I could no longer allow myself that luxury. I couldn't keep lying to Hayes, destroying everything we had built together over the years. I took a deep breath and pressed call. Jet answered soon after, his voice sounding slightly surprised, as if he sensed this wouldn't be a casual conversation. "Lainey, is something wrong?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. "Jet, we need to talk," I managed, barely holding back my emotions. "But not in the usual way." "I understand." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "Do you want us to meet?" "No," I replied, feeling my voice tremble. "This has gone too far. I can't keep doing this. I just can't." He fell silent, and in that quiet, I felt his pain, but also his understanding. He knew this moment would come, and perhaps had even been expecting it. "I understand, Lainey," he finally replied, his voice thick with sadness. "But you know, I never regretted what happened between us." "And I don't regret it either," I said, feeling my heart tighten. "But I can't allow myself to destroy my life. Our lives. It's wrong." "I'll miss you," he said softly, and I felt tears rising to my eyes. "I will too, Jet," I replied, closing my eyes to keep from breaking down. "But maybe this is our lesson. Maybe we needed to feel what we felt to see what truly matters." The silence between us was heavy, yet somehow freeing. I knew this was the end, and that it was the only right choice. Our feelings hadn't disappeared, but I had made my decision. For the sake of my family, for the years Hayes and I had shared, for the future I couldn't allow myself to ruin. We said our goodbyes, and when the call ended, I felt a strange relief mixed with deep pain. The next morning, as I approached the window with a cup of coffee, I saw a familiar car pulling out of the driveway. Jet. He was leaving, and something inside me twisted painfully. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't left a note, hadn't even sent a message. He just left, as if nothing had ever connected us, as if it had all been a dream that faded with the first light of day. I stood there, gripping my cup, unable to tear my eyes away from the road where his car soon disappeared around the corner. A sense of emptiness washed over me. I knew this was supposed to be the end, that we had both made the right decision, but the emptiness was so profound, it felt as if I were standing on the edge of an abyss. I understood that Jet had given me freedom, had allowed me to make the choice and move on. But with that choice came pain. I tried to tell myself that this was just a fleeting moment, that it was a passion that would fade with time, days, weeks, months. But there was also a mark left behind that could never be erased. I went back to the kitchen, trying to distract myself with chores, but every little thing reminded me of him. Everything that had happened between us felt surreal, as if he hadn't just been a person, but a symbol of the part of me I had long ignored. He had awakened something in me that I had hidden and suppressed. When Hayes returned home that evening, he was just as he always was, reserved, calm, confident. He asked how my day went, as if he suspected nothing. I replied as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was now an invisible chasm between us. I felt that I would never be able to tell him what had happened, that I would hide that part of myself. But I also couldn't help but wonder if I would ever truly be able to restore my former life. When I lay in bed beside him, the feeling of emptiness enveloped me once again. I understood that everything Hayes and I had, our history, our life, was what we had built together. And yet now, inside me, there was another world, one I could never share with him. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that time would heal everything, that I would forget Jet, that his image in my memory would eventually fade, becoming dim and insignificant. But deep down, I knew this feeling would never disappear.